green in tooth and claw, the misanthropic mission of climate alarm, because very much this green ideology is something that is being done to us, it's being done to society, it's being done to humanity, and the object is control. Nothing to do with science, nothing to do with nature, nothing to do with ethics, purely control. There's me on the front cover. Actually, my middle daughter, Ksenia, was also in that picture, but you can't see her. She's about there. And I did ask her if she wanted to be on the front cover of the book, but she declined. But yeah, she was there at this rally with me. It was around the time when the COVID protests sort of morphed into anti-World Economic Forum, anti-New World Order protests. Nowhere near as big as they were at the height of COVID, but we've kind of kept it going. And of course, all these things are still going strong. Stand in the Park, the Yellow Boards, the Light newspaper, which I write for every month. And yeah, so net zero kills. And this is a message that appears on lampposts all around Bexhill-on-Sea. Nothing to do with me, of course. Net zero kills. The local council, Rother District Council, has signed up to something called UK 100. And if you ask your average person on the street, what's UK 100, they've probably never heard of it. But UK 100 is the most destructive program yet to control citizens. So what they're doing, what these technocrats, as we might call them, are doing, is they're using local government to bring in these things. Central government as well, but they find it much more effective to bring things in at local government level, where your average councillor is absolutely clueless on what this is all about. So this is about how a predatory masterclass uses ecological doom to impoverish, enslave, and depopulate humanity. And when I talk about a masterclass, and we talk about a two-tier society sometimes, so there's going to be an elite, a technocratic elite that runs the world, or at least runs the Western world and wherever it can of Africa and everywhere else. It wouldn't, strictly speaking, be two-tier society. There would still need to be a middle tier. And that's because totalitarian regimes always need a professional managerial bureaucracy to police, to act as officers for their regime. But because of technological advances, AI, even those professional bureaucratic sort of managers and professionals will not be needed in the same number. But certainly for a while there will be a need for such people, and they occupy like the NHS, doctors and nurses, midwives, legal profession. If you look at COVID-19, most of the professional class was absolutely adhering to the official narrative, weren't they? So this is all about control, and that's the message we've got to get across to people. It's got nothing to do with saving the planet. It's got nothing to do with nature, nothing to do with science, nothing to do with philosophy, ethics, scruples. It's purely about control. Eugenics. This came about from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, sort of mid-19th century. And that made two fundamental transformations, really, to how humankind saw itself. So suddenly, this theory showed that the Bible, Holy Scripture, was no longer accurate as historical fact, or at least that's what the theory of evolution suggests, that the Earth is, millions of years older than what was it, 4,500 years in the Bible or whatever it is. But that was one thing. But secondly, more importantly, it removed the special status of human beings. Human beings were just evolved animals. And there you have Charles Darwin having slowly evolving from his chimpanzee state. I think it was his nephew. Anyway, a close relative of Charles Darwin was this guy, Sir Francis Galton. And Sir Francis Galton, he was kind of following on what emerged after in the aftermath of Darwin's book. We had something called social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is the concern of the ruling class that in industrialized societies, like Britain, there was a rapidly growing population. And the population was mostly growing rapidly in the working class. And there was a sense that, for the ruling class, that if this goes on, they're going to be overwhelmed. You know, these poor laboring classes working 12, 14 hours a day in the factories, working for a pittance, living in damp slums, that there's going to be a revolt at some stage. You know, we had a burgeoning sort of trade union movement. So the labouring classes are beginning to get organised, and this is very worrying for the ruling class. And the point of social Darwinism was that human civilization was going against a principle of nature, which is survival of the fittest. You know, this arose from the theory of evolution. Instead, by bringing in sort of the beginnings of a welfare system and the rapidly rising population, because more and more children in working class families were surviving despite all the diseases that were around. You know, those days women typically had 9 or 10 children. The population was escalating. And so it looked like, in these towns, from the ruling class's perspective, the quality of people was poor. These were not like the agricultural labourers of the 18th century or early 19th century that fought at Waterloo. No, these are like weaker physically and mentally, and just a poorer quality of human being from their perspective. And there was, you know, a growth of alcoholism and crime and all kinds of vice and really unhealthy living conditions, which was hardly the poor people's fault, but that's what it was. So a sense that there was survival of the unfittest, and therefore the ruling class had to act. It was down to the intelligent sort of rungs of society to do something about this problem. And Francis Galton founded the Eugenics Society. And one of the things that the Eugenics Society was interested in doing was stopping the procreation of tainted human stock. That's the kind of language that they used. And it was about, you know, curtailing the the breeding, basically, of the great unwashed. And the Eugenics Society was very big. And by the early 20th century, most of the intelligentsia were advocates of eugenics. So I'm talking about scientists, political figures, art and literary figures. This was seen at that sort of upper levels of society as an absolute priority. And here we have the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, who was an acquaintance of Sir Francis Galton, and George Bernard Shaw is known for his plays like Pygmalion, but he's actually a very nasty character. And here he is, one of his sayings: "There is now no reasonable excuse for refusing to face the fact that nothing but a eugenic religion can save our civilization." In my book, Green in Tooth and Claw, I speculate that the First World War was the first major act of eugenics. The official reasons for the First World War is that Archduke Ferdinand was shot in Serbia, and that led to millions of men dying in the mud of Flanders, you know? I mean, yeah, there's no real satisfactory explanation in historical events for that carnage occurring. My sense is that the powers of Europe, because they had the same problems in Germany and France as they had in Britain, the view was that we have to do something about this burgeoning political movement in the labouring classes. There could be revolution. And the ruling classes really did fear that they could end up having something done to them like happened with the French Revolution. So the best thing to do is start a war. And the First World War was devastating. I think there was about 4.5 million British servicemen died in that war. The total was, I think about 50 million or something like that over the 4 years. So it was a successful cull, if that's what it was intended as. And from the cull, we had collectivism. Not the collectivism that the working classes really wanted. There was never any demand for communism in the British working classes. I mean, they used to say about the Labour Party of Keir Hardie that it was always more about Methodism than Marxism. The ordinary British working class people, they wanted better standards of living. They weren't after this sort of ideological totalitarian system of communism. But that's what happened, or at least that's what happened to Russia. Russia was ideally placed as a largely peasant society and a country that has suffered very badly in the First World War. It was ripe for the first major experiment in totalitarian collectivism. And the Bolshevik revolution certainly didn't arise from ordinary Russian people. It was funded by the major banks, by the Rothschilds, and so on. And Lenin went to Russia in a sealed train with millions of pounds. And, but it was made to look like this was a working class revolt in Russia, which it very definitely wasn't. So George Bernard Shaw in 1910 came up with a really interesting idea for eugenics. He said, why don't chemists work on creating a gas chamber for the undesirable elements of society? Now, this says something about the way that the intelligentsia of society works, not just then, but today, is that if people in the intelligentsia are seen as being on the right side, they can say the most awful things and get away with them. So there was George Bernard Shaw proposing gas chambers for the undesirable elements of society. And jumping forward to today, we have the scientific advisor to the World Economic Forum, Yuval Noah Harari. And what's his word for the undesirable elements of society? What's his phrase for them? Useless eaters. useless eaters. And there's a YouTube video which they tried to take down, but it's still circulating, of Yuval Noah Harari saying, what are we going to do with all the useless eaters? Because there's not going to be work for them. And you could see what he's really thinking, but he says, well, maybe for a while we could just get them on video games. Yeah. But you could see what he was really thinking. Right, so my book starts, chapter 1 of my book, which I'm not going to talk about much today, is about the genuine green movement, because there really was, and perhaps still is, one. Yeah, and just very quickly, the first really successful Green Party was in Germany, and the problem was that as soon as the German Greens became successful, they were infiltrated by Marxists. And so genuine people who really wanted, to work towards a clean world of harmony between humanity and nature, the Green Party was infiltrated and eventually overrun by what we might call watermelons, people who are green on the outside but red on the inside. And James Delingpole, of course, wrote the book Watermelons on the deceit of the green movement. But jumping ahead to the next chapter 2 and chapter 3 of my book, parallel lines. So I've got the long march from Frankfurt and the road from Columbia to Washington. So just to kind of just describe what I mean by this. Frankfurt was the base of the Institute of Social Research, otherwise known as the Frankfurt School, and critical theory. And does anyone know what term that we use, and we're very heavily criticized if we use it, for the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School? You will be called anti-Semitic if you use this term. Cultural Marxists, right? Now, I brought out a book co-written with Robert Olds about 4 years ago, and it was about woke ideology. And so I went back into the past to look at where these ideas came from, and looked quite intensively at the work of the Frankfurt School and the cultural Marxists from Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, and others. And my friend Robert, he is in with quite a lot of the political parties because of the think tank that he works for, called the Bruges Group. And he happened to have a stall at the Conservative Party conference, and Robert knows quite a few MPs from his work with the think tank, and some MPs were picking up this book. And someone from, now was it Hope Not Hate? It was one of these groups that always sort of castigating anyone with sort of right-wing or conservative views, as being awful racists and that sort of thing. And anyway, Hope Not Hate had this article all about our book and how it was some of the worst anti-Semitism that they'd seen for a while. And it was there, distributed at the Conservative Party conference. And I thought, wow. I mean, I was quite very naive then. I mean, let me be quite honest, right? Before COVID, I was onto COVID straight away. I could see, I worked in healthcare, and I could see straight away. But I was completely asleep. I mean, you guys, most of you probably way ahead of me, right? It's only the last 4 years that I've kind of woken up to a lot of things going on in the world. I mean, 4 years ago, I believed the Americans landed on the moon. I really did. I did. Anyway, and I believe that The Twin Towers in New York were struck by 2 planes. I knew nothing about CGI then, you know. So anyway, so I'd written a book that was deeply anti-Semitic, and that was news to me, because the book doesn't mention Jews, doesn't mention Israel, mentions nothing about, there's nothing in there about like the Holocaust or anything like that. But if you use the term cultural Marxist, you will be accused of peddling anti-Semitic tropes. Now, I know a lot more about the Frankfurt School now, and I can see where they're coming from. So I did happen to know that most of the professors of the Frankfurt School were Jewish, right? And because they were Jewish, they were likely to be persecuted under the Third Reich, the Nazi regime. So a lot of them fled. Many of them ended up in the USA. But now here you get onto like thin ice, because I'm not going to make any sort of apology for the Nazi regime. But one of the big concerns in Germany in the sort of 1920s, early 30s, was that these guys were trying to subvert traditional German society. And there was another school actually that started a few years earlier called the Institute of Sexology. Now we think this transgenderism thing is fairly recent. No, it's being pushed by the Institute of Sexology in 1919 for the same reason that the cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School were doing their thing. So what were they doing? What were they trying to achieve? And it was realized that Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, countries like that, where people were used to having some kind of living in a civic democracy, and they're used to having rights and liberties, that they wouldn't fall for communism the way that the mostly peasant and the ravaged population of Russia after the First World War did. So they realized that if you want to, if they were going to have revolution, it would have to be a slow process, and that nothing changes unless the culture changes. And so if you're ever criticized for using the term cultural Marxism, ask the person who's challenging you, what would you then call Marxists who want to focus on culture rather than economics? What would you call them? By their own definition, they're cultural Marxists. Right, now what has this got to do with green ideology, you may see? Well, I think, and I'll touch a bit more on this later, that green and woke are 2 sides of the same coin. They're both for the same purpose. Right, so we've come a long way with this march. So the easiest way I could summarize cultural Marxism is to subvert society by undermining all the sort of cement that keeps society together. And I tend to categorize that as the 3 F's: faith, flag, and family. And that's their key targets. And my goodness, haven't they come a long way? So take faith, for example. We live in what is nominally a Christian country, but how many Christian people would feel happy about talking aloud about their Christian beliefs, apart from in private conversations with people they know? Not many, because people would be thinking, oh, maybe that might offend somebody. How many people would fly a Union Jack in their garden without thinking, somebody might think this is racist? And how many people would talk about marriage as being the bedrock of society? Marriage between a man and woman? No, they won't, because they've been told that that these messages have completely seeped into society now. So the long march, you could say, is almost complete. And woke ideology is like the extreme kind of the sort of new Puritans who are pushing this. They're like the sort of Red Guards in Mao's China. It gets ever more extreme. And that has undermined society so much that society is in a state of uncertainty and confusion and anxiety and ready to believe that there's a deadly virus even though there's no evidence of it, and ready to believe that there's cataclysmic climate change even though there's no evidence of it. So society has been broken by these guys. Meanwhile, so let's go back to the 1920s. And the thing is that climate change, when I was at school, we did nothing about this green stuff, nothing at all about it. I remember there was a little bit about nuclear war and Armageddon, but nothing about the climate change, right? So we tend to think it's quite recent. I mean, my daughter Demelza, every subject at her school, climate change is crowbarred into it, isn't it, you know? But there wasn't really much of it until really the last sort of 3 decades, I think. But it goes back a long way. It goes back, these things go back, woke ideology goes back to the 1920s through cultural Marxism. Green ideology goes back to the 1920s with Technocracy Incorporated, a group that probably hardly anyone, has anyone heard of Technocracy Incorporated? Right. Technocracy Incorporated was a body that started in 1919. So after the First World War, you had the emergence of these global bodies. The League of Nations, which was the forerunner to the UN, and you had what I'd call globalist organizations working towards an eventual sort of global government, the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, and the Institute of International Affairs, Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House in London. But more importantly, I think, is, certainly for today, is Technocracy Incorporated. And this body, so with all the tremendous advances in technology after the First World War, in the 1920s, it got to the point where some scientists and politicians and philosophers thought that we're going to get to the stage where we could have total control of society using technology. So, you know, 1920s and 30s, there was nothing that anyone could call a computer back then. But data technology methods were rapidly advancing. And what the technocrats wanted was to get rid of these messy things that we have in society: democracy, freedom of speech, debate, politics, ideology. Get rid of all of those things and just have society run on rational lines with engineers serving an elite. An elite would know the way forward for society to go, and they would be advised by engineers. And Technocracy Incorporated wanted to redraw North America as what they called a technate. That was a country that was run basically a technocracy. And it had a lot of followers, but it kind of faded away, partly because well, you had the Second World War, and after the Second World War, see, Technology Incorporated were biggest at the time of the Great Depression. There was the idea that the whole global economy was going to collapse. But after the Second World War, the opposite of that, you had the boom, certainly in the US, a real consumer boom. So technocracy kind of seemed irrelevant to people. But it never went away. And this guy here, again, probably, he's certainly not a household name. If you buy a book on history of the United States of America, or a modern history of the United States of America, and you look up this guy in the index and he won't appear, and yet he's probably the most important person in American political history. He is bigger than Kissinger, this guy, and bigger than any presidents, right? Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he wrote a book called, I can't remember the full title of it right now, but it was about heading for the technocratic age, so it's a slightly different word for technocracy. So,
is there like a grand chessboard? I think that was one, wasn't it?
Yes, but indeed, in the late 1990s, Brzezinski brought out a book called The Grand Chessboard. And you know in George Orwell's 1984, the world is split into three powers, isn't it? Yeah, you've got Oceania, which is us, right? The West, basically. You've got Eurasia, which is Russia, and you've got East Asia, which is China. And there needs to be three, because they need to be alternating who's at war with each other. And they're perpetually at war. And Zbigniew Brzezinski in The Grand Chessboard describes, so Orwell was writing fiction, but Brzezinski describes that as this is how the world will be. Interestingly, George Orwell was an acquaintance of Aleister Crowley, who was an occultist, but also very, very well connected man in the security services. And my sense is that both Brave New World by Aldous Huxley and 1984 by George Orwell were written on Aleister Crowley's recommendations that we need to get these ideas out there. It's all predictive priming. So Brave New World is where a future society has got no fight. They don't need to fight. They've got everything they need. They take their Soma tablets. So that's like your, it could be your antidepressants or it could be your smartphone. George Orwell, so in a way, Aldous Huxley was describing the good side or the carrot. George Orwell was describing the stick, because he needed to have both. I reckon that Aldous Huxley had a lot of influence on those books being written. And how did George Orwell know that here we are in 2024, where we have Oceania, East Asia, and Eurasia plotting World War III? Because that's basically what we've got. And talk about alternating war. At the moment, Russia is the target, but they've got China there as well, you know, ready to. And there's a sort of alliance between Russia and China. There's a lot of nasty people in these on these slides, but this guy, Frank Bookman, is actually one of the good guys, and he started a globalist, an organization that was about creating global peace, but inevitably that would need some governance, right? And he called it moral rearmament. So he after the First World War, he believed that society needs to re-find its morals and to develop sort of moral resilience against getting into future wars. Of course, didn't happen because with the Second World War. But moral rearmament was infiltrated by the sort of more the darker kind of globalist characters. But Frank Bookman was a Christian, and he set up this organization with good intent. The Bilderberg Group, 1954, I think, met for the first time with the Dutch royal family, British royal family involved in it as well, major political figures, bankers, Rothschilds, had meeting in secret, and kind of that is the way that these globalist organizations work. They they're not secret organizations because we know about them, but their minutes, what actually happens in their meetings is kept private. But I'd like to go back to this character here. Has anyone heard of Richard Kudinov-Kalergi? Again, not a household name. But these are guys that you really need to know about. Berzhinsky and Kudinov-Kalergi. There's something very, very controversial, and this is even more controversial than cultural Marxism. You could just about get away with making a mistake about using the term cultural Marxism. You apologize for it, and you'd be kind of let off, just don't do it again. But if you mention this guy, you'll be in big trouble. This guy is the most controversial figure you can mention in any socio-political discussion. If you talk about Kalergi, you will be seen as an anti-Semitic, far-right conspiracy theorist that is not just wrong, but dangerous. And you could be reported to prevent the anti-terrorist police just for mentioning this guy. So hopefully there's no hidden cameras in there. Why is this guy? Yeah. So why is this guy so controversial? And again, I was so asleep until about 4 years ago. I was so asleep. I remember just before COVID, I remember seeing some stickers on a lamppost saying something like, "Beware the Kalergi plan." Beware the Kalergi plan. And I thought, what's this? And I went home, looked it up on the internet, and saw that I was reading about some very, very dangerous thing that I should, definitely shouldn't mention again. So, who was Richard Kudinov-Kalergi? According to Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf, this guy is a cosmopolitan bastard, right? Now, you think about Hitler writing at the time of the cultural Marxists who are trying to subvert the kind of traditional norms of German society. Well, this guy was kind of like a bête noire of Hitler and what he wanted to do. And of course, I'm not making any excuses for Adolf Hitler and his what became, a nasty totalitarian regime. But Kudinov-Kalergi was an Austrian aristocrat, and he was half Japanese. And I think that could explain something about what he went on to write, because if you think about Austrian society in the early 20th century, I'm sure it was very, Austrian, right? So to have somebody with who, slightly, you probably can't really see it. It's probably not the most Japanese-looking picture of him, but there are some other pictures where he's got more of a sort of Japanese features, and so he just stood out. And he may have experienced some, discriminatory sort of comments. Anyway, he wrote a book called Practical Idealism. And that book is also known as the Kalergi Plan. But it's not really a plan as such. And that's why fact checkers will always say that Kalergi Plan is a right-wing conspiracy theory that is false, right? There is no book called the Kalergi Plan as such. But what Richard Kudinov-Kalergi wrote about in Practical Idealism is that we need to transform white European society. We need to bring in multitudes from Africa and Asia so we can mix everybody up. And eventually we'll end up with a sort of milky coffee skinned people. And above that would be a masterclass, a new nobility, if you like. and the new nobility would be made up of the two superior races. And the two superior races were Jews and Chinese. They would be Orientals. So he probably included Japan in that, Orientals. So he saw Jews and Orientals as the most rational people, the cleverest people, and the people who are less prone to sort of emotional sort of acting out and warlike behavior. So Koudenov-Kalergi wanted a melting pot. And his book is very hard to get, but I don't know if you know my friend David Curtin. David was a chemistry teacher. He taught in Germany for many years, and so he's quite very fluent German speaker and reader. And he's actually got the book, and so it's important to be able to translate, because otherwise you're going on, you're not sure what is quoted is actually real. But David has told me that this book is actually even worse. It's even worse than it's portrayed as. So that the New World Order would be run by a masterclass on a racial hierarchical basis. Now, of course, we can say with certainty that Hitler was racist. He wanted an Aryan supremacy. So Hitler was racist. But this guy was racist too. He just wanted a different race, or two races in charge. Right, now we're jumping forward to 1968. And I've called 1968 Anno Domini, because the Green movement is like a religious cult. Two things happened in 1968. Well, hold on a minute, look away from what's on that slide. What is 1968 known for? The year 1968. Yeah, revolution in the air. What's that song, pop song that was out around the time? You know the one about revolution. I forget the name of the band now. You know the one. Yeah. I mean, and who was revolting? So there was the French students. There were the Americans protesting about the Vietnam War. There was a civil rights movement in the US. There was a rapid rise of second wave feminism and the beginnings of the gay rights movement as well. And these all happened to erupt at the same time in 1968. And of course it wasn't naturalistic. These things tend to be set up to happen, right? So we remember 1968, or most people remember 1968, as the year of emancipatory, revolutionary spirit, yeah? All good, yeah? All good, positive stuff. Progressive, yeah? But actually, 1968 was more important things going on. And those were the publication of The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. There was a chap in the late 18th century called Reverend Malthus, who said that the population of the world rises at a the food supply is rising because, human beings were learning more productive farming methods. But food production was rising on a geometric scale. Population was rising on a logarithmic scale. And we would reach a point where we were going to starve. And that was kind of rubbished over the 19th and 20th centuries until this guy came along with his book, The Population Bomb. Now, by the 1960s, Western society's population is fairly static. You haven't got women having 9 or 10 children anymore. It's down to around about replacement level, which is, I think, 2.1 or 2.2 per woman. And the signs are that it's probably might even go down a bit further, right? So population might actually decrease. And Japan was a good example of that. Now, why did the population first start to decrease in Japan? Why was Japan the first Western country, can we call it that? Well, anyway, a developed country. It's not a Western country, developed country. Why was Japan the first country to start a population decrease? Advanced technological country with no immigration. And this is the thing, that if the birth rate goes down to below 2.1 and there's no immigration, then you're going to have a population fall. And that could actually become a problem, right? And it has been a problem. It is a problem in Japan. But Paul Ehrlich is arguing completely the opposite of that. Paul Ehrlich is saying the population is out of control. And to most people living in the West, 1968, 1970s, 1980s, you think, well, what's this guy talking about? He's another crank like Malthus. Yeah? But this book wasn't written for the likes of you and I. This book was written to set the rationale for ecological doom, which eventually we would learn about. So Paul Ehrlich came up with these nonsensical predictions that there was going to be mass starvation by 1980. Yeah, so that's where Al Gore sort of followed that kind of thing about give the most dire predictions and it will get your book attention. So Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb, the population must be controlled. We must radically start to reduce the human population. And the second thing was the start of the Club of Rome. Now, even people who are in our sort of what we might call the freedom movement, or people who are awake, they know about globalist organizations, right? So let me just ask you, what would you say are the globalist organizations that you hear about the most? United Nations, yep. World Health Organization, which is a United Nations agency, yeah. And any others? NATO. World Economic Forum. I mean, World Economic Forum is so UN's got some kind of official kind of status, hasn't it? World Economic Forum is supposed to be just like a private members club or something like that, That's the way they operate, these globalist organizations. So there's the World Economic Forum, there's the Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg Group, and there's also the Club of Rome. And arguably the Club of Rome is the most important of all, because it was the Club of Rome that took this concept of ecological doom to the United Nations and made it that the United Nations would focus almost entirely on a climate crisis. Eugenics was very the whole intelligentsia, as I said, was kind of advocates or supporters or interested in or had favourable ideas about eugenics in the early to mid 20th century. But because of what happened with the Nazis, the Third Reich, eugenics got a bad name. So the term eugenics kind of stopped being used after the Second World War. But the head of UNESCO, United Nations, the scientific agency, was Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley. And Julian Huxley said in 1947, when that agency was founded, Julian Huxley said that the public has now got a distaste for eugenics. But eugenics lives on. And we're going to, I'm not quoting him verbatim here, but this is what he basically said. We are going to reinvent eugenics. We're going to cloak it in green. So way back at the end of the Second World War, it was decided that they're going to invent a climate crisis. They're going to invent ecological doom. And the Club of Rome made sure that the United Nations was pursuing this agenda. And the book, The Limits to Growth, a Club of Rome report, was rather like the population bomb in it. It said that humanity was facing catastrophe within 20 to 30 years. David Rockefeller, of course, behind all this. He's behind everything. The Rockefeller family. Rockefellers and Rothschilds behind everything. You can't really be accused of being anti-Semitic for talking about David Rockefeller because his family was Baptist by background. But mention the Rothschilds and yes, you'll be AS. Another very important character, again, not household name. The most important people are not household names. They keep themselves in the background while doing very big things. Maurice Strong was a Canadian oil man who was kind of chosen by Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller to get the ecological doom moving, get it to become center stage. And center stage was first achieved in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 at the Earth Summit. Political leaders, including the UK, went to this shindig at Rio and they signed on the dotted line. They signed up to all the things that are happening now. They signed up to Agenda 21. And almost everything that's being done on net zero is pursuing Agenda 21. Now you think about back in 1992, you know, who was a British Prime Minister? Was it John Major by that time? I don't know. Yeah, John Major. You know, you can imagine them signing this, thinking, oh, this is all good about, you know, looking after the planet, and not really caring too much. And civil servants would be telling them, oh, yeah, this is fine. We've got to sign this. We've got to show there's a unified global movement to protect the environment. And the green movement has needed scientific justification, hasn't it? And it's needed sort of top quality scientific evidence to show that we really are facing ecological disaster. And have you heard of the hockey stick? Yeah, Michael Mann devised this hockey stick, and there he is sort of holding one to show his, you know, how he's using this as a sort of symbol of how global temperatures have been sort of gradually reducing, and then suddenly, around the time of the beginning of the 20th century, shooting up. Look, uncontrollable, right? It's all fraud. But it doesn't matter. If the UN support it, and all the globalist organizations support it, but actually this was taken down very badly by a couple of Canadian scientists, and it became a bit of an embarrassment, and it was dropped. Another embarrassment is this guy here, Al Gore, who was a failed US presidential candidate and then moved into the climate crisis as his big thing. And this book here, An Inconvenient Truth, was given out to kids in schools all around the world. Massive, the biggest environmental bookseller ever, I think. There was a film made of it as well. And dire predictions. I've listed some of them in the book. None of them have come true. I think one of them is he said that by 2100, sea levels will have risen by 20 feet, right? Well, he wrote that in 2006, And it's now 2024, and he's still got 20 feet to go. Not many people realise that Britain was at the vanguard of the climate change agenda. You might think that Britain is just going along with things, you know, doing its bit. No, Britain was seen as a very important country to push this forward and to go further, go beyond what was being done by the EU and other countries. In the US, there was always a lot of pushback against, even signing the Kyoto Protocol. But we had Tony Blair's New Labour government, and Tony Blair became quite chummy with this guy, George Soros, the Hungarian mega financier, oligarch. And Soros is the perfect example of the marriage between cultural Marxism and the green agenda. They're two sides of the same coin. He funds subversive political movements like Black Lives Matter, for example, and the
Colour revolutions.
Antifa.
Colour revolutions.
Yeah, colour revolutions, of course. Yeah, this man as
also funds paedophilia, legalising paedophilia in certain states.
yeah. Well, hang on a bit, because he's got Jewish background, so I can anti-Semite you. Yeah. Are you saying that paedophilia is a Jewish thing? No. Yeah. But yes, of course, yeah. He's funding all these subversive movements and the colour revolutions. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes. Ukraine. Colour revolutions. They always come up with a nice sort of glossy, kind of fashionable, trendy way of doing things, don't they? And New Labour was trendy. Let's be honest. I mean, look back to what it was like in 1997. It was like a cult, wasn't it? And but Tony Blair's place as Prime Minister became a bit unsustainable after the Iraq War, and he handed over to Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, every bit as much of a globalist as Tony Blair. And these brothers here, Ed and David Miliband, both had their turn at the Department of the Environment, although it was called something different when Ed Miliband was there. And the Climate Change Act was the most ambitious target yet anywhere in the world for decarbonisation. So we're not quite at net zero yet, but 80% decarbonisation. And that was way more than any other country had gone. Now, the Chinese people, rather like the Russian people before the Bolshevik Revolution, mostly poor, kind of peasant-like existence, but living the way their forefathers had always lived, on the land. A very sort of agrarian economy, China. But under Chairman Mao, people started to be moved out of the countryside and into the cities. And that escalated in the late 20th century. Suddenly you had cities of 10 million people that just emerged from nowhere. And megalopolises of 3 cities joined together, because and the towers, like 50, 60-story towers, apartment blocks, and those people were needed for the factories, because China had become the workshop of the world, sending its container ships across the world, all of our worldly goods. If you get a MAGA hat, Make America Great Again, made in China. Okay, so now why am I talking about China here? Because China was a laboratory for the mass urbanization of the population. We are now heading towards rural clearance. They want people to live in smart cities. Now, it's quite difficult to get people like you to uproot from your nice houses in Bexhill-on-Sea to go and live in Elephant and Castle, right? But Elephant and Castle, just using that as an example, because I used to work near there, it's growing continually. Every time I go past there on the train, there's another plot of land being, I don't know what was there before, bulldozed, the pile drivers are going in, and another huge apartment block goes up. Who's living in these blocks? All foreign migrants. All people from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. People who don't know anything different in Britain. They've come here, they don't know, they don't know about, areas of suburban housing with box hedges at the front and all that sort of thing. That's not their culture at all. They've come to this country and they've got a flat in the metropolis, and maybe that's something that they would covet. But they're all being put into smart cities because that's what's being developed. Of course, at the moment you don't have this, but very soon you will have in and out entry by QR code. They'll know every movement of people living in these blocks. And they'll be run on the lines of 15-minute cities where people will have everything they need, supposedly everything they need, within walking distance, so they can't go anywhere else. Is anyone else here a black sheep in their family? Yeah? Well, I am, because I'm the only one that's even slightly awake. I'm not talking about my family at home, because my girls are all pretty awake. They come and protest with me, right? I'm talking about my mother, my recently deceased father, my siblings. They're all completely asleep. And one of the things I said to my sister recently, I was talking about, is she loves going on holiday, always has. And I said something to her about how, it's probably a good idea to get your holidays in now, because all the airports are going to close. And she's thinking, oh God, there's Neil going on again with his conspiracy theories. And I said, look it up. Look it up on Google. Right? No, I didn't say look it up on Google. I said look it up. I said look up absolute zero. There's a report called Absolute Zero, commissioned by the government. Now, the government doesn't commission reports if it doesn't have an idea what it wants in that report, does it? Right? And one of the things that has to happen by 2030, and it's almost beyond belief. I mean, but this is a report. It's not necessarily going to happen, but this is what's recommended to achieve net zero, is that by 2030, every airport is going to close down in the UK with the exception of Belfast, Glasgow and Heathrow. Now, I think that's unlikely. But these reports are done for a reason. They often set targets that are not achievable, but they make it clear where they want to go. And so this really is going to happen. You're starting to see things like night flights stopped at certain airports. You're starting to see some routes disappearing. So we're just at the thin end of that wedge at the moment. But that is very clearly an aim. It's to stop us from flying. Of course, there'll still be planes in the sky, but there'll be private jets. And there'll be the military aircraft of Airstrip 1. Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, I don't know if you've heard at the moment, but there's this controversy. It's all over the Daily Mail today. Lee Anderson, a Tory MP, has been suspended by the Conservative Party. Have you heard this? Yeah? And his offence was that he'd said Sadiq Khan is running London for his Islamist chums, right? And what I believe is that Lee Anderson has got this wrong. Sadiq Khan is not acting for Islamists, he's acting for globalists. because he is one. And he's been the chair of C40 Cities, which is all about setting up this kind of system. And of course, his ULEZ. Now, let me, sorry for picking on my sister, I'll beg forgiveness later. But another thing about my sister is that she lives in London, and she didn't really know much about ULEZ, even though they have a car, right? But they've got a new car, so they're not affected by ULEZ, right? And so it's not really, even when I sort of was talking to her about it, not really bothered. And she even thought that the charge, only £12.50 a day, only applies to people driving into London from outside. I said, no, it's for London residents. They're trying to get rid of cars in London. And, oh, God, there's Neil again with crazy conspiracy theories. Oh, my goodness. When does he stop, you know? Crazy. And I wanted to say to her, I said, do you really think that Transport for London would go to the expense of putting cameras on almost every lamppost at junctions all around Greater London, at huge expense, just to fine a few people like Piers Corbyn with a 1990s Vauxhall Cavalier? Really? Of course, he's going to be bringing in road charging for all and making it very difficult for people, except the very rich, to have a car at all. Absolute zero, then, is what they're going for. And this is going to affect what we eat, because livestock is a major producer of methane and other nasty gases that have been around forever, but suddenly they're poison, right? So we've got to stop eating meat and fish and eat these nice lab-grown locusts and mealworms. And they're coming for your cats and dogs. Now, if I was to say this to my sister, she'd think I've really gone off my head. She's got 5 cats and a dog. Why are they coming for cats and dogs? Well, the obvious reason is that cats and dogs consume carbon. But the thing about cats and dogs is that, like us, they are carbon. And as I have on the front cover of the book, you are the carbon they want to reduce. On the cats and dogs thing, the reason I put that there, the reason I focus on this, is that it's so hard to get across to people just how serious this situation is that we're in. But if you talk to them about something very precious to them, their cats and dogs, they might begin to wake up and think, hold on a minute, there's something wrong here. And I had an article on this on a website 2 weeks ago, and I think it's my biggest ever article in terms of readership. And it was being republished on sites all around the world. Saving the planet. Of course, what they really mean is saving the planet for themselves. I've picked on a few people here. There's Prince, now King Charles, of course, with, being told, you can see who's really in charge here. Sadly, Evelyn de Rothschild has passed away last year, but the Rothschilds live on. Larry Fink. Do you know these guys? Who's Larry Fink? BlackRock. And again, but 4 years ago, I knew nothing about BlackRock. I've had a steep learning curve, but probably we've all had a bit of a steep learning curve, haven't we, over the last few years. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, just a random nerd who devised a social media platform. Yeah. CIA from start to finish. Francoise Bettencourt Myers, L'Oreal. Look her up. She's quite a character. Oprah Winfrey. I was watching a video the other day. I think it was it Kate Garraway? All these people in the media, these presenters, they're all groomed. They're not just talent that just emerges. And there's I don't know if you have ever watched or listened to Mark Devlin, the DJ, talks about the rock and pop scene and how the idea that bands just by luck are in the right place at the right time. No, it's all set up. That is still Madonna, I think. Jeff Bezos, Amazon, is selling my book, taking most of the money. It's a big club, and you ain't in it. Al Gore's beach house. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly, spot the solar panels. You'd think he might be able to afford a few on that roof, wouldn't you? But also, what's he doing buying a beach house? Because this is a guy that says the sea levels are rising 20 feet. Doesn't quite make sense, does it? Maybe they're just not going to rise in wherever this is, I don't know, but it doesn't really make sense, does it? Yeah, and several others. But we are all part of the Great Resist. Lots of yellow here, that's our colour, isn't it? Yellow, colour of freedom, the smiley face, the yellow boards, and the Light newspaper, which, I've been helping to give that out in Bexhill, and I'm sure many others here will have had the same experience. It's become so easy to give this out now. I mean, it used to be really quite hostile, got a lot of heckling from people, whereas now people come and take them out of your hands. This is now tyranny. That placard, I had to put that up because of the sad loss of my good friend Jeff Wyatt. And he was always there at the front of the anti-lockdown protests, which were really very brutal. The policing, very, very nasty, very nasty. I mean, you can get hit by one of these, as some people here may have experienced. I've certainly heard the thwack on people's skulls right next to me. This was a brutal attempt to quash resistance against the regime for a fake. Just to finish then on this line, it's so important. Say this to people as much as you can. You are the carbon they want to reduce. Thank you.